They say the Alpha King hadn't smiled in 7 years. Not since the day his mate died bringing their son into this world. Not since the morning he woke to find half his heart buried in the frozen ground of the Northern Territories. They say his face became stone, his eyes became winter, and his palace became a tomb where laughter went to die. But legends have a way of crumbling when they meet the gentle hands of an unexpected soul. This is the story of how one quiet Omega, one injured child, and one moment of pure compassion shattered the ice around the most powerful heart in all the kingdoms. Before we begin this journey together, I need you to do something for me. If this story touches your heart, if you feel that flutter of emotion building in your chest, don't just listen and leave. Drop a comment below telling me the city you're watching from so I can send you a virtual hug. Share this with someone who believes in second chances. And stay until the very end, because the final words of this tale will change how you see love forever. Now, let's step into a world where power bows to tenderness, and where a king learns that strength isn't the absence of feeling, it's the courage to feel everything. The village of Monteverde sat in a valley so remote that maps often forgot it existed. Tucked between mountains that scraped the belly of heaven and forests that whispered secrets older than kingdoms, it was a place where time moved like honey, slow and golden. The people of Monteverde didn't concern themselves with the politics of alpha courts or the intricate hierarchies that governed the wolf territories. They grew their vegetables, tended their animals, raised their children, and lived their lives in blessed obscurity. Among them lived Serafina, an Omega of 23 years who possessed a peculiar quality that set her apart even in this humble place. While other Omegas carried the typical sweetness of their designation, that gentle, nurturing energy that made them treasured in pack structures, Serafina possessed something deeper. Something that transcended biology. She had a stillness about her, a quietness that wasn't shyness but rather a profound peace, as if she'd somehow touched the very center of existence and found it good. Her cottage stood at the edge of Monteverde, where the village yielded to wilderness. It was a small structure of weathered stone and aged timber, with a garden that shouldn't have thrived in the mountain climate but did anyway. Serafina had a way with growing things. Herbs that refused to flourish for others bloomed abundantly in her care. Wounded animals found their way to her door with uncanny frequency, and she never turned a single one away. The villagers thought her strange but harmless. Her father, Giacomo, had been the village healer before his death 3 winters past, and Serafina had inherited his knowledge of medicines and his gentle touch. Her mother, Alessandra, had been an Omega of exceptional sweetness who died bringing Serafina into the world, a parallel that would prove significant in ways nobody could have imagined. Serafina had never traveled beyond the mountain passes. She had never attended the gatherings where young Omegas might catch the eye of ambitious alphas. She had never desired the complications of pack politics or the intensity of the mate bond. She was content with her garden, her healing work, and the profound solitude that allowed her to hear the deeper rhythms of the world. But contentment, as the old ones say, is often the prelude to transformation. 1,200 miles to the north, in a palace carved from black stone and ancient power, ruled King Alessandro Dominic Corvinus. He was called the Frost King by some, the Stone King by others, and simply the Alpha by those who feared to speak his name with any embellishment. His territory stretched from the frozen wastes of the north to the river kingdoms of the south, encompassing dozens of packs, hundreds of settlements, and millions of wolves who lived under his protection and his law. Alessandro had taken the throne at 19 when his father fell in battle against the rogue clans of the eastern wastelands. He'd consolidated power with an iron fist and a strategic mind that bordered on prophetic. By 22, he'd ended the border wars that had plagued the territories for generations. By 25, he'd established trade routes and alliances that brought prosperity even to the remotest packs under his rule. And then he'd met Violetta. Beautiful, fierce Violetta with her silver eyes and her laugh that sounded like wind chimes in a summer storm. Their mating had been a grand affair, celebrated across every territory. For 2 years, the kingdom had basked in their Alpha King's happiness. He smiled then. He laughed. He held court with warmth and ruled with wisdom tempered by joy. Then came the pregnancy, the complications, the choice that wasn't a choice at all: save the mother or save the child. Violetta had made the decision before Alessandro even knew there was a decision to make. She'd left letters, instructions. Her last words to him were written in her elegant script: "Choose our son. Let me live in him. And Alessandro, my love, promise me you won't become stone. Promise me you'll smile at him the way you smiled at me." It was a promise he couldn't keep. The child was healthy, strong, a beautiful boy they named Matteo, with his mother's silver eyes and his father's dark hair. Alessandro held him once, felt the weight of him, looked into those eyes that should have brought joy but brought only the stabbing reminder of what they'd cost. Then he'd handed the infant to the nursemaids and walked away. For 7 years, Alessandro ruled his kingdom with unprecedented efficiency and absolute emotional isolation. He provided for his son materially. The boy wanted for nothing. The finest tutors, the best trainers, every advantage. But Alessandro couldn't bear to be in the same room with him for more than minutes at a time. Couldn't bear to see Violetta's eyes looking at him from that small face. Couldn't bear the guilt that came with loving the child who lived because his mate died. The court whispered. The servants worried. And young Matteo grew up in a palace full of people but starving for the one thing no amount of wealth could purchase: his father's love. The autumn that Matteo turned 7 was particularly harsh. Winter came early to the northern territories, sweeping down from the Arctic reaches with teeth of ice and claws of wind. Alessandro had matters of state that required his attention in the southernmost territories: disputes over hunting grounds, trade negotiations, the tedious but necessary work of keeping a kingdom running. He took his personal guard. He took his advisors. He did not take his son. Matteo, for his part, had grown accustomed to his father's absence. The boy was bright, curious, and desperately lonely in the way that children who are surrounded by adults but starved for genuine connection often are. He'd learned to find joy in small rebellions, slipping away from his tutors, exploring the palace's forgotten corners, befriending the kitchen staff and stable hands who treated him with more warmth than the nobles who bowed with empty eyes. On the 3rd day of his father's absence, Matteo convinced his guards that he was ill and needed rest. Then he slipped out through the servant passages he'd long ago discovered, made his way to the stables, and did something monumentally foolish. He took his pony, a gentle mare named Luna, and rode out into the forest alone. He'd heard the stablemaster talking about a hot spring deep in the woods, a place where the water stayed warm even as the world froze. Matteo wanted to find it, wanted to prove he could do something brave, something adventurous, something that might make his father proud if he ever bothered to notice. The forest had other plans. 3 miles from the palace, Luna spooked at something Matteo didn't see. She reared. He fell. And in the falling, his small body struck a fallen log with a sickening crack that echoed through the silent trees. Pain exploded through his left arm and his head struck frozen ground and the world went fuzzy at the edges. Luna bolted, disappearing into the undergrowth, leaving Matteo alone with a broken arm, a bleeding head wound, and the rapidly encroaching cold that could kill a grown wolf, let alone a 7-year-old pup. He tried to shift, the way he'd been learning, but the pain made it impossible to concentrate. He tried to call for help, but his voice was swallowed by the vast indifference of the wilderness. He tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't cooperate and the world kept tilting in ways that made his stomach revolt. So he did the only thing left to do. He curled into himself, pressing against the base of a massive oak tree, and began to cry. Not the loud wails of a child demanding attention, but the soft, hopeless sobs of someone who understands, perhaps for the first time, that the world is vast and cold and doesn't always send rescue. Serafina had gone into the forest that morning to gather herbs. There was a particular moss that grew only on the north side of the oldest trees, and old Giuseppe in the village was suffering from joint pain that this moss, properly prepared, could ease. The forest was her sanctuary, the place where her quietness felt most natural, where she could hear the language the world spoke beneath the noise of human concerns. She was 3 hours into her gathering when she felt it. Disturbance. a wrongness in the pattern of things. Serafina had learned long ago to trust these feelings, these subtle tugs at the fabric of her awareness. She set down her basket, closed her eyes, and listened with something deeper than ears. Southwest, young, afraid. She began walking, her feet finding the path without conscious thought. The forest seemed to open before her, guiding her through underbrush and over streams with unusual ease. Birds called warnings. A deer crossed her path and looked at her with knowing eyes before bounding away. 20 minutes later she found him. The small boy was barely conscious, curled against a tree with one arm bent at an angle that made Serafina's healer instincts scream. Blood matted his dark hair from a head wound. His lips had taken on a bluish tinge from the cold. But it was his eyes that struck her, silver eyes that opened as she approached, filled with pain and fear and something else. Recognition, perhaps, or hope. Serafina didn't hesitate. Didn't wonder who he was or where he'd come from. Didn't calculate the risk or the responsibility. She simply dropped to her knees beside him, her hands already moving to assess his injuries with a sure touch her father had taught her. "Hello, little one," she said softly, her voice carrying that peculiar quality of absolute calm that could soothe even the most panicked creature. "I'm Serafina. You're hurt, but you're going to be all right. I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Matteo, through the haze of pain and cold, felt something he hadn't felt in his 7 years of life. Safety. This stranger with the kind eyes and gentle hands radiated something that his whole being responded to on an instinctive level. His Omega nature, still young and unformed, recognized something essential in her. He nodded, unable to speak past the pain and fear. Serafina worked quickly. She removed her heavy cloak and wrapped it around him, sacrificing her own warmth for his need. She examined his arm with careful fingers, determining that yes, it was broken but cleanly. The head wound looked worse than it was. Scalp wounds always bled dramatically. The real danger was exposure and shock. "I'm going to pick you up now," she said, positioning herself carefully. "It's going to hurt your arm, and I'm sorry for that. But my home isn't far, and there I can help you properly. Can you be brave for me?" Matteo nodded again, and when Serafina lifted him, surprised by how light he was, all thin limbs and fragile bones, he buried his face against her shoulder and didn't cry out despite the agony that must have lanced through his broken arm. Serafina carried him through the forest, her Omega strength, often underestimated by those who didn't understand that endurance and nurturing required their own kind of power, more than equal to the task. She murmured to him as she walked, soft words of comfort and encouragement, telling him stories about the forest, about the herbs she gathered, about her garden that grew impossible things. And Matteo, cradled in her arms for the first time in his life, experiencing the full force of an Omega's protective nurturing, felt something shift in his small chest. Felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the cloak and everything to do with the realization that someone, this stranger, cared whether he lived or died. Not because of duty, not because of who his father was, but simply because he was a child who needed help. Back at the palace, the absence was discovered within 2 hours of sunset. The guards who'd let him rest were frantic. The staff mobilized. Search parties swept the grounds and the immediate forest. And someone made the decision to send word to the king. The message reached Alessandro in the middle of trade negotiations with the southern territories. 7 words delivered by a breathless messenger. "Your son is missing. Lost in the forest." For a moment, just one moment, the stone cracked. Alessandro felt something sharp pierce through the careful numbness he'd cultivated for 7 years. Terror. Pure primal terror. The kind that strips away pretense and political calculation and reveals what's underneath. His son, too. 7 years old and lost in a forest as winter descended and wolves, the animal kind, not their kind, roamed hungry. Alessandro abandoned the negotiations. He shifted into his alpha form, a massive black wolf with eyes like amber fire, and ran. His personal guard struggled to keep pace as he pushed himself to speeds that would have killed a lesser wolf. Mountains that should have taken days to cross were traversed in hours. He didn't stop, didn't rest, didn't allow himself to think about what he might find, or what he might not find. In her cottage, Serafina worked through the night. She'd set Matteo's arm with a skill her father would have been proud of, creating a splint from carefully chosen branches and securing it with soft cloth. She'd cleaned and stitched the head wound with thread finer than spider silk and a touch so gentle the boy barely flinched. She'd made him drink bitter tea for the pain and sweet tea for the shock, and wrapped him in her warmest blankets before her fire. And then she'd simply stayed with him, because she understood, in that intuitive way of truly gifted healers, that his physical wounds weren't his deepest hurts. The way he'd clung to her, the way his eyes followed her around the room with an almost desperate intensity, the way he'd whispered, "Please don't leave," when she'd stepped away to prepare more medicine. This was a child starving for connection, for care that went beyond duty, for love that asked nothing in return. So Serafina pulled her chair close to the bed she'd made for him near the fire. She held his uninjured hand, and she told him stories. Stories her father had told her, and her grandmother before that. Tales of ancient wolves who'd been so powerful they could speak to the stars. Legends of omegas who'd held packs together through sheer force of compassion. Fables about healing and hope and the resilience of small things. Matteo listened with silver eyes growing heavy, fighting sleep because he was afraid that if he closed his eyes, this gentle stranger would disappear like a dream. But eventually, exhaustion and pain medication and the profound comfort of Serafina's presence pulled him under. She sat with him through the night, monitoring his breathing, checking his temperature, adjusting his splint. And as she kept vigil over this unknown child, she felt something stirring in her own chest. Something maternal and fierce and completely unexpected. She'd healed many creatures over the years, but this felt different. This felt like the universe had placed something precious in her hands and whispered, "Guard this." Dawn was breaking when the howls started in the distance. Serafina stiffened, recognizing the sounds of a search pack. They were coming from the north, moving fast, and there was an intensity to their calls that spoke of urgency and authority. She looked down at the boy sleeping in her care. He'd mentioned no name, no family, but the quality of his clothing beneath the dirt and blood, the refined speech patterns even through his pain, this was no common child. This was someone important. Someone whose absence had clearly triggered a significant response. Serafina had no desire to involve herself in the complications of pack politics. But neither would she shirk her responsibility to return a child to his family. She rose quietly, ensuring Matteo was still sleeping comfortably, and stepped outside to wait for the inevitable arrival of whoever was searching for him. The sun was barely above the horizon when they came. A pack of wolves in their animal forms, moving with military precision through the forest. And at their head, a massive black wolf who was clearly their leader. An alpha. And not just any alpha. The power rolling off him was suffocating, the kind of dominance that made every instinct in Serafina's omega nature want to submit, to lower her eyes, to show her throat. She did none of these things. Instead, she stood straight and calm on her cottage doorstep, her hands folded before her, and waited. The black wolf shifted as he approached, and Serafina found herself looking at the most striking man she'd ever seen. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that spoke of both power and burden. His face was all sharp angles and hard lines, beautiful in the way that glaciers are beautiful, remote and dangerous and utterly breathtaking. His eyes were amber, unusual for their kind, and currently blazing with an emotion that might have been panic if such a thing were possible in someone so clearly made of stone. "Where is my son?" His voice was a command, rough with hours of running and fear he'd never admit to feeling. Serafina met his eyes, a boldness that made several of his guards tense, and spoke with her characteristic calm. "The child is inside. He was injured but he's stable. I've set his broken arm and stitched his head wound. He needs rest and care, but he will recover fully." Alessandro moved toward the door, intending to push past her, but Serafina stepped slightly to the side, blocking him with nothing but her presence. He's sleeping. If you wake him roughly, you could disturb his arm. And he needs the rest more than he needs to be startled awake. For a moment, Alessandro simply stared at this small Omega who dared to stand between an alpha king and his objective. He could have moved her aside with one hand, could have commanded her to submit, and she would have no choice but to obey. But something in her stillness, in the utter lack of fear in her eyes, made him pause. "Let me see him," he said, and this time it wasn't quite a command, almost a request. Serafina nodded and turned, leading him into the cottage. The interior was simple but warm, filled with the scent of herbs and wood smoke. And there, bundled in blankets by the fire, was Matteo. His small face was peaceful in sleep, one arm carefully splinted, a white bandage wrapping his head. But most striking was his position. His uninjured hand clutched a corner of Serafina's shawl, as if even in sleep he was afraid to let go of his connection to safety. Alessandro stood frozen. For 7 years, he'd avoided looking directly at his son. Had kept him at arm's length emotionally and often physically. Had seen him as a reminder of loss rather than a person in his own right. But now, seeing him injured, vulnerable, lying in a stranger's cottage because he'd been so desperate for adventure or attention or something that he'd risked his life, something cracked in the stone. He moved forward, dropping to his knees beside the makeshift bed with no care for his dignity or his position. His hand reached out, trembling slightly, and touched Matteo's hair with a gentleness that seemed impossible from such a hard man. "Matteo," he whispered, and the name came out broken. Serafina watched this unfold with understanding in her eyes. She'd seen this before in her healing work. The moment when someone realizes how close they came to losing something they'd convinced themselves they didn't need. The instant when denial shatters against the reality of mortality. Matteo stirred at his father's touch, his eyes opening slowly. For a moment, he looked confused, trying to reconcile where he was with what he expected. Then his silver eyes focused on his father's face, and something complicated passed through his expression. Hope and fear and longing all tangled together. "Papa." His voice was small, uncertain. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "Shoo." Alessandro's hand moved to cup his son's face with a tenderness he'd forgotten he possessed. "Don't apologize. You're safe. That's all that matters." Matteo's eyes filled with tears. "Are you angry?" And Alessandro, the Alpha King who hadn't shown real emotion in 7 years, who'd built his reputation on being unmovable and unbreakable, felt his own eyes sting. No, I'm not angry. I was terrified. I thought I'd lost you." "You came for me," Matteo whispered, wonder in his voice. "Of course I came for you. I will always come for you." Alessandro said the words and realized they were true. Realized that beneath all the guilt and grief and protective numbness, there had always been love. He'd just been too afraid to let himself feel it. Serafina had stepped back, giving them privacy, but she continued to watch. Because something was happening here that went beyond a simple reunion. This was transformation. This was healing of a kind that no herb or poultice could achieve. Alessandro looked up at her, and their eyes met across the small cottage. "You saved him. I found him. Helped him. But he's strong. He saved himself by surviving until help could come. What do I owe you?" Alessandro asked, falling back on the transactional because he didn't know how to process the emotional. Serafina smiled slightly. "Nothing. This is what I do. Heal. Help. There's no debt. There's always a debt. Not with me." Her voice was gentle but firm. "But if you want to repay something, I'd suggest spending time with your son. He needs you more than he needs anything else." The directness of it should have offended him. This Omega he'd never met, speaking to him as if she had the right to comment on his parenting. But Alessandro found he couldn't muster offense. 'Cause she was right. And because there was no judgment in her voice, only observation. Only truth spoken without malice or agenda. They stayed in Serafina's cottage for 3 days. Alessandro sent word to the palace that Matteo had been found and was recovering, but he didn't immediately return. Ostensibly, it was to ensure his son was stable enough to travel. In reality, it was because something about this place, about this quiet Omega and her simple life, made him want to stay. He watched as Serafina changed Matteo's bandages with hands that were somehow both competent and tender. Watched as she made meals that were simple but nourishing, grown in her impossible garden. Watched as she told stories that made his son laugh, that first bright sound of genuine joy Alessandro had ever heard from him. And he watched as Matteo bloomed under her attention. The boy, who'd been quiet and withdrawn in the palace, became animated. He asked questions about her herbs, about the forest, about healing. He helped her in the garden despite his splinted arm, carefully carrying small pots and watering plants under her gentle instruction. On the second evening, as Matteo slept and Alessandro sat by the fire, Serafina made them both tea and settled in the chair across from him. "Your Majesty," she began. "Alessandro," he interrupted. "In this place, I'm just Alessandro." She nodded, accepting this. "Alessandro, then. May I speak plainly? I suspect you're going to regardless of my answer." A small smile touched her lips. "Fair. Your son is desperately lonely. He's surrounded by people, I'm sure, but he has no real connection. No one who sees him as just Matteo rather than the heir or the prince or the obligation." Alessandro's jaw tightened. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Her voice remained gentle, but there was steel underneath. "I've spent 2 days watching him. Watching how he seeks approval for the smallest things. How he's surprised when someone asks his opinion. How he lights up at the slightest bit of genuine attention. These aren't the behaviors of a child who feels valued." "His mother died bringing him into the world," Alessandro said, the words coming out harsh. "Every time I look at him, I see what was lost. I understand that. My mother died giving birth to me. My father could have looked at me and seen only his loss. Instead, he chose to see me, to love me for myself, not as a reminder of pain. And did that come easily to him?" Serafina was quiet for a moment. "No. He told me once that the first months were torture. That he wanted to hate me sometimes because hating would have been easier than grieving. But he made a choice every day to see me as my own person. To give me the love I deserved rather than the resentment his pain wanted to assign." Alessandro stared into the fire. "I don't know if I can do that." "You've already started." Serafina leaned forward slightly. "You came for him. You stayed with him. You touched him with tenderness. These aren't small things. These are the foundation. Everything else is just building on what you've begun. And if I fail, if I try and I can't maintain it, then you try again, and again, and again, until trying becomes habit and habit becomes nature." He paused. "He doesn't need you to be perfect, Alessandro. He just needs you to be present." They sat in silence after that, but it was a comfortable silence. The kind that exists between people who've shared something true. Outside, wolves howled in the distance, and the fire crackled, and somewhere in that quiet cottage, something fundamental shifted in the Alpha King's heart. On the third day it was time to leave. Matteo was strong enough to travel, and there were kingdom matters that couldn't wait forever. Alessandro's guards had been patient, camping in the forest around the cottage, but their presence was a reminder of responsibilities that couldn't be indefinitely postponed. Serafina packed medicines for Matteo's journey, writing careful instructions for his continued care in a precise hand. She bundled food for their travel and checked his splint one final time, ensuring it would hold during the trip back to the palace. Matteo clung to her when it was time to say goodbye. His good arm wrapped around her waist. His face pressed against her side. "Can't you come with us?" he asked, his voice muffled. Serafina knelt so she was at his eye level, her hands on his shoulders. "Your home is in the palace, little one. My home is here. But that doesn't mean we won't see each other again. Promise." She smiled. "I promise. And you know what? You're going to be so busy with your father now, really getting to know him, that the time will pass quickly. Matteo looked uncertain, glancing at Alessandro, who stood nearby. The Alpha King stepped forward, and for the first time in his son's memory, he placed a hand on his shoulder. She's right. Things are going to be different now. Better. I promise you that. The boy's silver eyes searched his father's face, looking for sincerity, for commitment. And something he saw there must have satisfied him because he nodded slowly. Alessandro looked at Serafina over his son's head, and his expression was complex. Gratitude, yes, but also something else. Something he couldn't quite name. Thank you, he said, and the words carried more weight than such simple syllables should bear. For everything. Take care of each other, Serafina replied. As they prepared to leave, Alessandro did something unexpected. He removed a ring from his hand, heavy gold with a royal seal, and pressed it into Serafina's palm. If you ever need anything at all, send this, and you'll have the full resources of the kingdom at your disposal. Serafina looked at the ring, at its weight and its implications. This is too much. It's not nearly enough. She closed her fingers around it, accepting not just the gift but the responsibility and connection it represented. Then I'll keep it safe. They left as the sun climbed toward noon, Matteo riding with his father, looking back at Serafina until the forest swallowed her from view. And Serafina stood in her doorway, watching them go, feeling the strange emptiness that comes when something significant moves out of your life, even temporarily. The changes at the palace were immediate and dramatic. Alessandro didn't simply return to his previous patterns with a renewed attempt at connection. He fundamentally restructured his relationship with his son. Meals were taken together. Evenings included time in the library or the garden, just the two of them. Alessandro began teaching Matteo himself. History, strategy, leadership, but also listening to his son's thoughts, his questions, his observations about the world. The court was shocked. The servants whispered. And slowly, over weeks and then months, something unprecedented happened. The Alpha King smiled. Started small. A quirk of lips when Matteo said something clever. A genuine expression of pleasure when his son mastered a difficult lesson. But it grew. Alessandro rediscovered laughter. Found joy in his son's presence rather than pain in his absence. And as he opened himself to loving Matteo, the grief he'd been holding at bay for 7 years finally had space to be processed properly. He talked about Violetta now. Told Matteo stories about his mother. Her fierce spirit, her wicked humor, her capacity for love. And in telling these stories, Alessandro found he could remember her with warmth rather than just crushing loss. But through all of this, there was a thread running beneath the surface. A thought that wouldn't quite leave him alone. The memory of a quiet Omega in a forest cottage. The woman who'd saved his son but had also, in some fundamental way, saved him. Who'd spoken truth without fear and offered help without expectation of reward. Alessandro found himself wondering about her more than was probably appropriate. Whether her garden was thriving. Whether she was well. Whether she remembered them with anything like the frequency he found himself remembering her. Matteo, for his part, talked about Serafina constantly. He asked when they could visit. He wanted to send her letters. He drew pictures of her cottage and her garden and the way the firelight had made her hair glow like copper. Why don't we invite her to the palace? Matteo suggested one evening at dinner. His 7-year-old logic simple and direct. She could visit and stay in one of the nice rooms and see how well my arm healed. Alessandro considered this. Considered what it would mean to bring her into the palace, into the political complexities of court life. Considered whether she'd even want to come. But he also considered how much he wanted to see her again. How much he wanted to thank her properly. How much he wanted to understand why a simple Omega from an obscure village had made such a profound impact on both his son and himself. We'll send an invitation, he decided. And let her make her own choice. The letter reached Monteverde 6 weeks after Matteo's rescue. It was delivered by royal messenger, sealed with the king's mark, and it caused quite a stir in the village. Serafina was working in her garden when the messenger arrived, and she had to wipe dirt from her hands before accepting the cream parchment with its elaborate seal. The letter was in Alessandro's hand. She recognized it from the instructions she'd watched him write for Matteo's care. The writing was bold and precise, and the message was both formal and somehow personal. He wrote of Matteo's recovery, of the changes in their relationship, of his gratitude for what she'd done. And then, toward the end, a paragraph that made her pulse quicken despite herself. Matteo speaks of you constantly and wishes to see you again. I confess I share his desire, though perhaps for more complicated reasons. Would you consider visiting the palace as our honored guest? No obligations, no expectations. Simply an opportunity to see the child you healed and to accept our gratitude properly. If you're willing, the messenger will wait for your response and escort you personally whenever you're ready to travel. Serafina read the letter 3 times, standing in her garden as the sun climbed toward noon. She thought about her simple life, her quiet existence, her carefully maintained distance from the complications of pack politics and power structures. Then she thought about Matteo's silver eyes and his desperate need for connection. About Alessandro's broken expression when he'd knelt beside his son. About the fundamental rightness she'd felt in helping them. Sometimes the path forward isn't about what's safe or simple. Sometimes it's about following the pull toward something significant, even when you can't quite name what that significance might be. She went inside, penned her acceptance, and began preparing for a journey that would change the trajectory of her life in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. The palace was overwhelming. Serafina had grown up in a cottage with 3 rooms. The palace had 300. Maybe more. She lost count after the first hour of being escorted through marble halls and past tapestried walls and under ceilings painted with scenes from wolf mythology. But what struck her most wasn't the opulence. It was the coldness. Despite all the people, servants and guards and nobles moving through the corridors like schools of fish, there was a sterile quality to it. A lack of warmth that all the gold and crystal couldn't compensate for. She was given a suite of rooms that was larger than her entire cottage. A team of servants appeared to help her settle in, to draw a bath, to lay out clothing appropriate for dinner with a king. They were polite but distant, performing their duties with efficiency but no real connection. Serafina dismissed them gently, preferring to manage herself, and stood at the window looking out over the palace grounds. Gardens stretched below, meticulously maintained but somehow lifeless. Everything here was controlled. Perfect. She understood then what she'd sensed in Matteo. This place, for all its beauty, was suffocating. No child could thrive here without significant effort to maintain their spirit. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Matteo, who apparently hadn't been able to wait for the formal dinner to see her again. He launched himself at her with his characteristic lack of restraint, hugging her tightly. "You came. I told Papa you would come, but I was worried you'd think we were too far away or too formal or too." "Breathe, little one," Serafina laughed, returning his hug. "Of course I came. I promised I would see you again, didn't I?" They spent the afternoon together, Matteo giving her an enthusiastic tour of the palace through his eyes. Not the formal staterooms and throne halls, but the secret passages he'd discovered, the library corner where light came through stained glass in rainbow patterns, the kitchen where the cook would sneak him sweet pastries, the garden spot where he'd planted seeds in secret and was trying to make things grow the way she did. "They're not doing very well," he admitted, showing her a small patch of earth where struggling seedlings fought for life in soil that looked depleted and sad. "I don't have your gift." Serafina knelt beside the small garden, her fingers sinking into the earth. "It's not just a gift, Matteo. It's listening. Plants are like people, they tell you what they need if you pay attention. This soil is hungry, needs nourishment, and these plants are too crowded. They're competing instead of supporting each other." She spent the next hour teaching him, hands in the dirt together, talking about spacing and feeding soil and the way ecosystems worked when you let them breathe. And Matteo soaked it in with the hunger of a child who'd found not just a teacher but someone who made learning feel like discovery rather than duty. Alessandro found them there as the sun was setting. He'd been in meetings all afternoon, the tedious work of governance that never really ended, and had come looking for his son to prepare for dinner. What he found instead stopped him in his tracks. Serafina and Matteo were laughing, both of them dirty from gardening, the Omega showing his son how to properly tamp down soil around a transplanted seedling. The light caught in her copper hair, and her face was animated with joy, and something in Alessandro's chest twisted painfully. She looked up as if sensing his presence, and their eyes met across the garden. She smiled, that gentle expression that seemed to be her default, and gestured to Matteo. "Your son is going to be an excellent gardener. He has patient hands." Matteo beamed at the praise, looking to his father to see if he'd heard. Alessandro moved closer, and despite himself, he smiled too. "I can see that. Though I suspect his tutor might object to the dirt under his fingernails." "His tutor can expand his definition of education," Serafina said mildly, with no hint of deference or apology. Another woman might have been intimidated, standing before the Alpha King covered in dirt and contradicting the structured learning he'd arranged for his heir. But Serafina simply stood, brushing soil from her hands, meeting his eyes with that same calm certainty she'd shown in her cottage. And Alessandro realized something that should have terrified him but somehow didn't. He was fascinated by her. Not just grateful, not just impressed, but genuinely, deeply intrigued by this Omega who seemed utterly unbothered by power or position or the weight of his presence. "We should get cleaned up for dinner," he said finally. "Though I confess, I'm not sure the formal dining hall is going to feel appropriate after this afternoon." "Then don't use it," Serafina suggested. "Have dinner brought somewhere more comfortable. Life is too short to be uncomfortable in your own home." It was said so simply, as if she hadn't just suggested the Alpha King change centuries of protocol. But Matteo's eyes lit up. "Could we, Papa? Could we eat in the small dining room? Or even in your study like we've been doing?" Alessandro found himself agreeing, found himself giving orders to servants who looked bewildered but complied. Found himself an hour later sitting in his private study with his son and this Omega, eating a meal that was simple but excellent, laughing at Matteo's stories about his tutors, listening to Serafina talk about her village with genuine interest. Felt like the cottage. Like that strange bubble of peace they'd inhabited for 3 days. And Alessandro realized he'd been looking for a way to recreate that ever since returning to the palace. Maybe he'd been looking for a way to recreate her presence, specifically. Serafina stayed for a week that turned into 2. Officially, she was there as Matteo's honored guest. Practically, she became something far more significant. She spent her mornings with Matteo, supplementing his formal education with a kind of practical wisdom and emotional intelligence that no tutor was teaching him. She walked in the palace gardens and somehow made them feel more alive just by being in them. She took tea with the head housekeeper and within days had learned the names and stories of half the palace staff. And in the evenings, she dined with Alessandro. Sometimes Matteo joined them, but often the boy was tired from his day and went to bed early, leaving the 2 adults to talk. They spoke of everything and nothing. Alessandro found himself telling her about the complexities of ruling, about the constant balancing act between justice and mercy, strength and compassion. He told her about Violetta, really told her, in ways he'd never spoken to anyone else. About their courtship, their mating, the brief perfect years of their marriage. About the guilt he carried like a second skeleton inside his skin. Serafina listened without judgment, without offering platitudes or easy solutions. She simply held space for his grief the way she'd held space for his son's injuries, with competent tenderness and the understanding that healing happens in its own time. And she told him about her life. About growing up with her father's gentle wisdom, learning healing arts not as just techniques but as a philosophy of care. About the village and its rhythms, the satisfaction of growing things, the peace she'd found in simplicity. About the loneliness too, because she was honest about that. The isolation that came with being different, with having this gift that set her apart. "Don't you want more?" Alessandro asked one evening. They were in the palace garden. The real one, not the formal showpiece, but a wilder section that the groundskeepers barely touched. Don't you want a mate, a pack, children of your own? Serafina was quiet for a long moment, her fingers trailing over the leaves of a night-blooming flower. I've always thought that if such things were meant for me, they would find me. I don't need to chase them. And I've never felt incomplete without them. She paused, then added with careful honesty. Until recently, perhaps. What changed recently? She looked at him, and in the moonlight, her eyes were very green. I met a boy who needed a mother's love and a man who needed to remember how to smile. And I found myself wanting to be part of their healing. Part of their life. That's new for me. Alessandro's heart was beating too fast. Serafina. I'm not asking for anything, she said quickly. I'm just being honest. You asked what I wanted. I'm realizing I might want something beyond my cottage and my garden. I might want this. Whatever this is. The air between them felt charged, full of possibility and danger in equal measure. Alessandro had the sudden, overwhelming urge to reach for her, to pull her close, to kiss her until neither of them could think straight. But he held back, because this was too important to rush, too significant to risk on impulse. I'm glad you're here, he said instead. Matteo is thriving because of you. And I. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I find I'm remembering how to live instead of just existing. That's because of you too. You were already on that path. I just happened to be there at the right moment. No. His voice was firm. You were exactly what we needed. What I needed. There's no coincidence in that. They stood in the garden as night deepened around them, not touching but connected by something stronger than physical contact. And both of them felt the pull, the growing certainty that this, whatever this was becoming, was significant, potentially permanent, potentially everything. The court began to notice. How could they not? The Alpha King who'd been ice for 7 years was smiling regularly now, was taking meals in informal settings, was spending time with his son in ways that suggested actual affection rather than duty. And always, there was the Omega from the obscure village. The one with no pack connections, no political value, no apparent agenda. The gossip was vicious in some corners. Speculation ranged from reasonable to absurd. Some suggested she was using her Omega nature to manipulate the king. Others whispered that she was a gold digger who'd somehow orchestrated the prince's accident. The more romantic insisted she was the king's true mate, that Violetta had been a mistake and this was destiny correcting itself. The speculation reached Alessandro's ears through his advisors, who were concerned about perception and propriety. They suggested gently that perhaps the Omega should return to her village before her continued presence created complications. Alessandro's response was direct. Serafina stays as long as she wishes to stay. Anyone who has a problem with that can bring it directly to me. The word spread quickly. The Alpha King had effectively declared the Omega under his protection, which meant she was untouchable. Which meant the speculation would continue but the direct interference would stop. Serafina heard the whispers too. The palace staff, while generally kind to her, couldn't help but talk. She heard the theories, the concerns, the judgments. And she had to confront a question she'd been avoiding. What exactly was she doing here? She'd stayed far longer than a simple visit required. She'd integrated herself into Matteo's life, into the palace rhythms, into Alessandro's evening routines. She was playing house in a situation that had no clear definition and no obvious future. One evening, as she sat with Alessandro in his study, she decided to address it directly. The court thinks I'm your mistress, she said without preamble. Alessandro looked up from the document he'd been reading, his expression unreadable. I know. Does that bother you? Does it bother you? Serafina considered this. It should probably. But mainly it bothers me that we haven't discussed what this actually is. What I'm doing here. What you want from this. Alessandro set down his papers and gave her his full attention. What do you think I want? I think you're lonely. I think you and Matteo needed help rebuilding your relationship, and I provided that catalyst. I think you're comfortable with me because I don't want anything from you politically. But I don't know if that's sustainable. I don't know if I should stay. Do you want to leave? The question hung between them, heavy with implications. No, Serafina admitted. But I also don't want to be a temporary comfort. A placeholder until you're ready for something more politically advantageous. I've built a life on honesty and simplicity. I can't maintain that here if I'm living in ambiguity. Alessandro rose from his desk and moved to stand before her. He didn't touch her, but his presence was overwhelming. All that alpha energy focused entirely on her. You're right that you helped Matteo and me. You're right that your presence is comfortable. But you're wrong about it being temporary or placeholding. He paused, seeming to gather courage for something. Serafina, I haven't felt this way since Violetta. I look forward to seeing you every day. I find myself thinking about you in the middle of meetings. I want to know your opinions on everything. I want to make you laugh. I want. He stopped, and something vulnerable passed across his face. What do you want? Serafina asked softly. I want you to stay. Not as a guest. Not as Matteo's friend. But as someone who's choosing to build a life here. With us. With me. He took a breath. I'm not saying this well. What I'm trying to say is that I'm falling in love with you. Have been since that first day in your cottage, probably. And I know it's complicated, and I know there are political considerations, and I know it's only been weeks, but... Serafina stood, closing the distance between them, and placed her hand on his chest. Felt his heart racing beneath her palm. Alessandro, she said, and his name in her voice was gentle. I'm falling in love with you too. With both of you. But I need you to understand what that means for me. I'm not a political creature. Can't play court games. I can't be someone I'm not just to fit into this world. I don't want you to be anyone but exactly who you are. Even if that means I challenge you. Even if I speak truths you don't want to hear. Even if I remain, fundamentally, a simple omega from an obscure village who happens to be in love with a king. Alessandro's hands came up to frame her face. His touch reverent. Especially then. You're the first person in years who's treated me like Alessandro instead of the Alpha King. Who's seen past the crown to the man underneath. I don't want you to change. I want you exactly as you are. Serafina searched his eyes, looking for doubt or hesitation or the shadow of insincerity. She found none. Only honesty and vulnerability and the dawning wonder of someone who'd given up on ever feeling this way again. Then yes, she whispered. I'll stay. I'll build a life here. With you. With Matteo. For as long as you'll have me. Alessandro kissed her then, finally, after weeks of restraint and careful distance. Kissed her with 7 years of frozen emotion suddenly thawing, with loneliness transforming into connection, with a desperate relief of a man who'd thought he'd never feel whole again. And Serafina kissed him back, pouring into it all her quiet strength, her capacity for love, her certainty that this, improbable as it was right. Was real. Was meant to be. They were mated 3 months later, after a courtship that scandalized some and delighted others. Alessandro insisted on doing things properly, giving Serafina time to be certain, giving the court time to adjust, giving Matteo time to understand what this change would mean. The boy, for his part, was ecstatic. He'd been hoping for exactly this outcome from the moment Serafina arrived at the palace. The idea of having her as not just a friend but a mother figure was everything his lonely heart had craved. The mating ceremony was both traditional and unconventional. Alessandro insisted on the full royal protocol because Serafina deserved that recognition, that honor. But Serafina insisted on elements that reflected who they actually were. The ceremony took place partially in the palace gardens that she'd helped revitalize, and she wore flowers from Monteverde braided into her hair. When Alessandro marked her before the assembled court, claiming her as mate and queen, Serafina felt the bond snap into place with a rightness that confirmed every choice that had led to this moment. And when she marked him in return, she felt his soul open to hers completely, felt the depths of his love and his lingering grief and his profound hope that this them could work. The celebration lasted 3 days, but the moment Serafina remembered most clearly came on the second night. Matteo had been formally presented to the court as their son. Alessandro and Serafina had both insisted that the adoption be official and public. And afterward, in the privacy of their chambers, the three of them had simply held each other. "I have a mother now," Matteo had whispered, wonder in his voice. "You've always had a mother," Serafina had responded, thinking of Violetta. "But yes, you have me now too. And I'm not going anywhere." Alessandro had pulled them both closer, his family, his pack, his second chance at happiness. And for the first time since Violetta's death, he felt complete. Not because the grief was gone, it wasn't, and maybe never would be entirely. But because there was room for joy alongside the sorrow now. Room for love without guilt. Room for a future that honored the past without being imprisoned by it. 5 years passed. Serafina transformed the palace not through grand gestures but through 1,000 small changes. The gardens flourished under her care and became places where children played and couples walked, and even the most stressed advisors found moments of peace. The staff, once cold and efficient, became a community under her gentle leadership. She remembered names, asked about families, treated everyone from the lowest kitchen worker to the highest noble with the same respect and genuine interest. Matteo grew into a confident 12-year-old who could discuss battle strategy with his tutors in the morning and spend his afternoon tending plants in the greenhouse Serafina had established. He was being trained as a prince should be, but he was also being raised with emotional intelligence and compassion, with an understanding that true strength included the courage to be vulnerable and the wisdom to lead with both power and care. Alessandro discovered dimensions of himself he'd thought died with Violetta. He laughed regularly now, played with his son, made love to his mate with a passion that never seemed to diminish. He still carried the weight of leadership, still made hard decisions, still was the alpha king when the situation required it. But he was also just Alessandro. Husband, father, man who'd learned that opening his heart didn't weaken him but made him stronger. And Serafina, who'd once thought her life would be lived in a cottage at the edge of an obscure village, found herself queen of a vast kingdom. It was never a position she'd sought or particularly wanted, but she'd grown into it by staying true to herself. She used her position to establish healing centers throughout the kingdom. She championed education for omegas, arguing that nurturing natures were strengths to be developed, not weaknesses to be exploited. She remained, fundamentally, the woman who'd taken an injured pup into her arms, but now she had the resources to extend that care to an entire kingdom. The story of how they came together became legend. The Alpha King who never smiled until a quiet village Omega showed him how to love again. Parents told it to their children as a fairy tale. Bards sang versions of it in taverns. And through all the retellings and embellishments, the core truth remained. Sometimes the most powerful transformations come not from grand gestures or dramatic moments, but from simple acts of compassion offered without expectation of reward. On the 7th anniversary of the day Serafina had found Matteo in the forest, Alessandro commissioned a monument. It was placed in the palace garden in the section Serafina loved most, a sculpture of an omega holding a child, both faces peaceful, both embodying the power of care, of nurturing, of love that asks nothing and gives everything. They stood before it together as it was unveiled, Matteo between them, now nearly 14 and already showing signs of the leader he would become. A leader shaped by both his father's strength and his mother's compassion. "You know what the remarkable thing is," Alessandro said quietly, looking at the sculpture but speaking to Serafina. "I spent 7 years trying not to feel anything, trying to armor myself against pain by refusing joy. And then you appeared and taught me that you can't selectively numb emotion. If you close yourself to hurt, you close yourself to love too." Serafina leaned into him, fitting against his side in the way they'd perfected over years together. "And you taught me that a small life isn't necessarily a full life. That sometimes we're called to expand beyond our comfort, to impact more than just our immediate circle. I taught you that. You and Matteo both. You showed me that love isn't just about quiet contentment. It can be big and complicated and challenging and still be exactly right." Mateo looked up at them. These two people who'd somehow found each other despite impossible odds. Who'd built a family from grief and loneliness and one chance encounter in a forest. "Tell the story again," he said, even though he'd heard it hundreds of times. "Tell me how you found me." And Serafina, with Alessandro's arm around her and the evening sun painting the garden in shades of gold, told the story once more. About a day she went into the forest to gather herbs and found instead a purpose. About a boy who needed saving and a king who needed healing. About how the smallest acts of kindness can ripple outward in ways we never anticipate. About how love, real love, transforms everything it touches. The monument bore an inscription, written in Serafina's hand and carved into the stone base. In the moment between fear and hope, between isolation and connection, between a closed heart and an open one, there lives the possibility of transformation. This is dedicated to every soul who chose to care when caring was difficult, to love when loving was frightening, to open when opening felt impossible. May we all have the courage to be vulnerable enough to be changed. And beneath that, smaller, almost hidden unless you knew to look for it. For Mateo, who brought us together. For Violetta, who taught Alessandro to love. And for every quiet Omega who changes the world one gentle act at a time. Years later, when Mateo had children of his own and Serafina's hair had threads of silver woven through the copper, and Alessandro bore the weight of his years with grace, people would still talk about the Alpha King who never smiled. They'd tell the story to their grandchildren, embellishing it with each telling until it became something almost mythical. But those who were there, who lived it, who witnessed the transformation firsthand, they knew the truth was simpler and more profound than any legend. They knew that healing happens in quiet moments. That love isn't always dramatic or destiny-driven. Sometimes it's just two broken people choosing to be brave enough to try again. Sometimes it's a child who needed a mother and a mother figure who needed to be needed. Sometimes it's an Omega who saw past power to pain and chose compassion over caution. The Alpha King learned to smile again not because of magic or fate or divine intervention. He learned because one Omega took his injured pup into her arms and showed him, through that single act of care, what he'd forgotten. That allowing yourself to feel, to love, to connect, that's not weakness. That's the strongest thing anyone can do. And in learning that lesson, Alessandro didn't just regain his smile. He regained his humanity, his wholeness, his ability to be not just a king but a man, father, mate. A person who could honor his grief while still embracing his joy. Serafina never lost her essential nature. She remained the quiet, grounded presence she'd always been. But she learned to let that nature expand, to touch more lives, to recognize that influence isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply be exactly who you are and trust that's enough. And Mateo grew up knowing he was loved. By his birth mother whose sacrifice gave him life, by his father who learned to show that love despite his pain, and by his second mother who chose him not because of biology but because of something deeper. He became the kind of leader who understood that true strength includes gentleness, that authority is most powerful when wielded with compassion, that the measure of a king isn't just in his victories but in how he treats the most vulnerable in his kingdom. This is the story of the Alpha King who never smiled, until he did. Until a quiet village Omega with dirt under her fingernails and peace in her soul showed him that healing is always possible. That second chances are real. That love, the true kind, the kind that transforms, can find you even in the darkest woods, even when you've given up hope, even when you think your heart has turned to stone. All it takes is one person willing to care. One moment of compassion. One choice to reach out instead of turning away. The rest, as they say, is just the beginning of forever. If this story touched your heart, if you felt that pull of emotion in your chest, I need you to do something for me right now. Tell me in the comments what city you're watching from so I can send you a virtual hug across the miles. Share this with someone who needs to remember that healing is possible, that love finds a way, that broken hearts can learn to beat again. And most importantly, remember that you have the power to be someone's Serafina. To be the one who stops, who cares, who reaches out when someone is lost and hurting. You never know when your simple act of kindness might be the thing that changes everything. Now go out there and be the reason someone believes in second chances. The world needs more quiet omegas, more people who lead with compassion and transform lives one gentle act at a time.